Imagine a chapter of American history so dark that it almost defies belief. This is the era before the Civil War, the Plantation era, where the entire economy of half the nation rested on one horrifying foundation: human beings treated as livestock. By 1808, the United States had officially banned the importation of slaves from Africa. The transatlantic pipeline was shut down, at least on paper. For the booming cotton empire stretching across Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and beyond, that created an urgent problem. Demand for enslaved labor was exploding, but the legal supply had just been choked off. So how do you grow an unpaid workforce when you can no longer buy it from overseas? The answer that emerged in the Deep South was as ruthless as it was calculated. Certain plantations quietly shifted part of their operation from growing crops to something far more sinister: breeding human beings for profit. These weren't random tragedies hidden on backwoods farms. In states like Virginia, the Upper South had a surplus of enslaved people, while the new cotton frontiers of the Lower South were desperate for workers. A chilling internal trade developed, sometimes called the Reverse Underground Railroad, where men, women, and children were marched or shipped hundreds of miles to be sold at auction. But some of the most profitable slaveholders went even further. They turned their estates into what historians today carefully call slave breeding farms. Young women were selected, paired, and, in the coldest possible terms, expected to produce the next generation of children who would later be harvested for sale farther south. Pregnancy was incentivized, sometimes coerced, occasionally rewarded with an extra ration or a day off from the fields. Children born on these places weren't seen as sons and daughters. They were future capital, listed on ledgers right alongside mules and plows. Contemporary travelers, newspaper ads, and even court records from the time occasionally let the mask slip. One Virginia planter bragged in the 1830s that his increase, his word for the babies born into slavery on his land, brought him more money each year than his tobacco crop. Ads openly marketed fancy maids and likely young girls, with language that made their intended purpose unmistakable. We tend to think of slavery as an institution that simply exploited labor. But in parts of the antebellum South, it evolved into something even more dehumanizing: an industry that manufactured people the way other farms raised cattle. This is the hidden machinery behind the romanticized columns and magnolias, a biological assembly line built on broken families and calculated cruelty. And it's a chapter that, for obvious reasons, rarely made it into the old plantation tours. Welcome to the part of history they didn't teach you in school. Over the course of the 1700s, colonial and state laws steadily chipped away at whatever fragile traces of humanity the legal system had once granted to enslaved Africans and their descendants. Step by step, legislatures transformed human beings into legal objects. A person born in chains could be inherited like furniture, gambled away in a card game, or listed on an estate inventory right beside horses and cotton bales. By the early 1800s, the rules were absolute. No right to marry without the owner's permission, no right to own property, not even one's own children, because Southern legal codes explicitly declared that every possible claim belonged solely to the master. And make no mistake, the 1807 Act that ended the foreign slave trade wasn't born from conscience, because most founders weren't trying to starve slavery out. It was economics disguised as morality. The delegates who voted to close the Atlantic traffic knew exactly what they were doing. Thomas Jefferson, architect, author, declaration signer who wrote, "All men are created equal," while holding hundreds captive, including at least 6 of his own flesh and blood offspring by Sally Hemings, an enslaved teenager whom he owned, signed that bill himself. Banning imports didn't kill demand. It did the opposite. Almost overnight, prices soared. Once overseas shipments stopped, supply suddenly became scarce, and every person already enslaved on American soil shot up in value. Owning human beings became even more profitable because the only new workers now came from births at home. Those already here weren't just a workforce anymore. They were also living, breathing commodity stock that could be raised, marched south, and sold down the river. Traders openly advertised home-raised young Negroes of prime working age, or girls who would soon become breeders. From the 1830s through the 1850s, the internal domestic slave trade exploded into one of the fastest-growing businesses in early 19th century America. Nowhere was this clearer than in Jefferson's own Virginia. Tobacco, once the colony's king, had worn out the soil. Planters found themselves with far more enslaved people than their tired fields could profitably employ. So they pivoted to a new cash crop: people themselves. Breeding human beings became Virginia's most lucrative export, out-earning tobacco, rice, and indigo combined. While cotton boomed in the lower South, plantations there needed hundreds of thousands of new hands every decade. Between 1800 and 1860, roughly 1 million enslaved Americans were forcibly marched or shipped southwest in what historians now call the Second Middle Passage. The Upper South, especially Virginia, Kentucky, and Maryland, functioned as giant nurseries. Richmond became the Wall Street of human flesh, where traders posted signs reading "Cash for Negroes," and breeders bragged in newspaper ads about their yearly increase of prime boys and girls. They advertised it all openly in the Richmond, Lynchburg, and Alexandria papers. Dealers printed circulars promising a steadier, more profitable crop than anything that grew in the ground. That is the grim irony of the 1808 law. Presented to the world as a moral triumph, it was actually an economic gift to planters. The cruel math was simple. The fewer people arriving from Africa, the more every child born in an American womb was worth. The moment that child could walk to the auction block, he or she was headed deeper into Dixie, usually never to see their birthplace again. This dark nursery business was the hidden engine of King Cotton's empire, built quite literally on the backs of babies born in bondage and sold before they could walk. As cotton bales floated south on the Mississippi River, the same boats and barges carried chained human cargo, listed on the manifest right beside barrels of pork and molasses. By the decade before the Civil War broke out in 1861, Virginia alone was shipping out human commodities whose total value dwarfed everything else the state produced. The planters who once grew rich on bright leaf tobacco now grew richer on bodies instead of leaves. This was the real capital of the Old South. Picture this. It's the early 1800s, and across the Atlantic something remarkable is happening. In London, a tireless parliamentarian named William Wilberforce, backed by Quakers, Methodist preachers, and thousands of ordinary petition signers, has spent 20 brutal years fighting to kill the British slave trade. In March 1807, he finally wins. The Slave Trade Act sails through Parliament, and after midnight, to thunderous cheers. British ships are forbidden from carrying any more captive Africans. The tide, it seems, has turned. Word spreads fast. Abolition fever jumps the ocean. American newspapers reprint British speeches. Clergy in Boston and Philadelphia thunder from pulpits that the United States must follow suit. Surely they will. Meanwhile, down south, something very different is happening. A few years earlier, in 1793, a Yankee tutor named Eli Whitney had bolted a simple machine together on a Georgia plantation. Wooden rollers, wire teeth, a crank. The cotton gin. Overnight, it turned the stubborn, sticky seed green seed cotton that grew everywhere in the Deep South into pure white profit. One slave with a gin could clean 50 times more cotton in a day than by hand. Suddenly, cotton wasn't just a crop, it was rocket fuel. By the 1820s, the South was flooding world markets. By the 1860s, the slave states were producing 3/4 of the entire planet's cotton supply. Liverpool mills, French factories, New England textile towns, all ran on Dixie fiber. Politicians started calling it King Cotton, and they meant it literally. This one crop gave the South more economic leverage than oil gives Saudi Arabia today. Southern leaders grew cocky. "No power on earth dares make war upon it," bragged South Carolina's James Henry Hammond in 1858. Cotton is king. They genuinely believed that if they ever seceded, Britain and France would rush to their defense just to keep the bales flowing. Europe would starve without Southern cotton, and the North would fold in weeks. So here's the bitter twist. At the exact moment when slave-grown cotton was becoming the most valuable commodity on Earth, when every new acre of Alabama or Mississippi wilderness promised fortunes, when the demand for field hands was exploding, Congress and President Thomas Jefferson proudly announced they were ending the slave trade. On January 1st, 1808, importing Africans became illegal in the United States. It looked noble on paper. In reality, it was the best thing that ever happened to slave owners' balance sheets. With the Atlantic spigot turned off, the only source of new laborers was natural increase right here at home. Every child born to an enslaved mother was born into permanent, inheritable bondage. And now, thanks to the new law, that child was worth far more than before, because no fresh shiploads were coming to compete. The 1808 ban didn't weaken slavery, it supercharged it. Cotton acreage exploded. Prices for prime field hands doubled, then tripled. And the internal slave trade, buying and selling American-born men, women, and children, became the second biggest business in the South after cotton itself. All while the rest of the Western world was moving to extinguish the trade, the United States took the most profitable cash crop in history, paired it with a captive labor force whose supply could now only grow from within, and hit the accelerator. King Cotton didn't just wear a crown. He sat on a throne built from the 1808 abolition that never really abolished anything at all. The moment the United States closed the Atlantic slave trade in 1808, something perverse happened. Instead of weakening slavery, the new law handed American slaveholders a golden monopoly. From that day forward, the only legal way to acquire new slaves was to manufacture them domestically. Planters wasted no time. They turned human reproduction into a branch of agriculture. They gave it a harmless-sounding label, natural increase. A phrase you'll see over and over in ledgers and letters, as if babies simply rained from the sky. In truth, it was one of the most tightly managed enterprises on any plantation. Enslaved women suddenly became the most valuable assets on the balance sheet, not just for the work they could do with their hands, but for what their bodies could produce. Ned and Constance Sublette describe it with unflinching precision in The American Slave Coast. The womb itself was turned into capital equipment. For perhaps the first time in their lives, many of these women received something that looked like medical attention. Southern medical journals that had once ignored black suffering now ran detailed essays on obstetrics for Negro women. Midwives and doctors were summoned when labor went wrong, not out of mercy, but because every lost infant and every dead mother represented a direct financial loss measured in hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars. A healthy young woman who could reliably deliver 4 or 5 surviving children was marketed like prize livestock. Auction advertisements praised her openly. First-rate breeder proven by 7 living children. Excellent constitution, quick to increase. Infant mortality was brutal, often 40 to 50% in the first year, so owners pushed for constant pregnancy to make up the difference. Rest between births was considered wasted time. Some plantation owners offered a heartbreaking bargain. If an enslaved woman could give birth to 15 living children, they promised she would earn her freedom. A very small number of women actually reached that impossible goal and were eventually set free. Far more never made it. Either they passed away from the strain, or their children were sold away long before the count was finished. The pressure began terribly young. Girls were often forced into motherhood as soon as they reached their early teens. Many had their first child before they turned 14. That newborn, born on American soil with no transatlantic voyage behind them, was already considered extremely valuable, often worth more at auction than a skilled tradesman could earn in an entire year. Mother and child alike were inventory. The woman was sent back to the fields weeks after delivery. The infant was raised just well enough to survive until it could be sold or put to work. This wasn't a side effect of slavery. In large parts of the Deep South, it became the business model. People weren't just being exploited for labor anymore, they were being farmed. And the 1808, the year America told the world it had taken a moral stand against the slave trade, was the year that system locked into place for good. For an enslaved girl, the clock started brutally early. Menarche, often at 12 or 13, was not a private milestone, it was a signal. Plantation records, traveler diaries, and former slaves' own testimonies all agree. The moment a girl was deemed of breeding age, the expectation of pregnancy followed almost immediately. By 20, many women had already carried 4, 5, sometimes 6 pregnancies. Some did not survive that decade. The pattern was merciless and methodical. Forced sex, pregnancy, a dangerous birth, a recovery period measured in weeks, not months, then back into the fields and back into the cycle. Rest was a luxury no ledger allowed. Pregnant women were not spared the auction block. Traders sold them at 7, 8, 9 months, advertising the coming child as a free bonus with statements like, "Handsome mulatto girl, quick with child, due in December, child goes with the mother." The mother's body, swollen and exhausted, was still paraded, poked, priced, and shipped south in chains. Rape was not an occasional crime in this world, it was policy. White men, owners, overseers, their sons, even visitors operated under total legal immunity. No matter how violent, no matter how young the victim, Southern courts refused to recognize the concept of rape of a slave. A black woman could not testify against a white man, and her body was, by law, his property to use. Many children born on plantations clearly resembled the men who owned the plantation, and sometimes even shared their first names. The case of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings is only the best-known example. In their later testimonies, formerly enslaved people described how owners would visit the cabins at night and select whichever woman they chose. On some plantations, teenage girls were made available to the master's sons as a disturbing coming-of-age custom. On the so-called breeding farms, the intrusion went deeper. Owners dictated who could pair with whom, separated couples at will, rewarded good breeders with an extra blanket or a Sunday off, punished women who did not conceive quickly enough. Marriages among the enslaved existed only at the master's pleasure and could be dissolved the moment a trader offered the right price. There was no corner of intimacy left untouched. Even when enslaved people managed to form their own relationships, they did so knowing the man in the big house could, and often did, override every boundary. This was not sex. This was not love. This was not even lust in the human sense. It was scheduled, supervised, monetized reproduction, enforced by whip and auction block. And every child that resulted, no matter who the father was, entered the world already branded with one legal identity: property. That is the reality hidden behind the gentle plantation myths, a reality that turned women's bodies into assembly lines and girlhood itself into a commodity to be spent before it ever truly began. On some plantations, the pretense of marriage among the enslaved was dropped altogether. Owners didn't wait for affection, consent, or even stable couples. They staged pairings the same way a horse breeder matches a stallion to a mare. Former slaves called the men who were loaned out for this purpose stockmen, or traveling bucks. A strong, tall man might be marched or shipped from one plantation to another, kept just long enough to impregnate as many women as possible, then sent on to the next farm. His own wife and children, if he had any, were irrelevant. The goal was simple: churn out healthy field hands who could survive the cotton rows and the rice swamps. The proof is in the numbers. In 1860, economist Richard Such studied Virginia's slave population, the epicenter of the domestic breeding trade, and uncovered something staggering. On the largest slave-rearing estates, women outnumbered men roughly 2 to 1. Across the entire state, there were as many as 300,000 more enslaved females than males, an imbalance found nowhere else in the Western world at that time. The only plausible explanation: deliberate breeding for profit. White society wrapped the whole thing in a poisonous theology. Many sincerely believed that a white man's sexual domination over black women was part of God's natural order. Improving the stock, they called it. Any resulting children were seen as proof of their own benevolence, lifting the race through their superior blood while conveniently adding new property to the estate. House slaves, constantly under the master's roof and eye, suffered the worst of it. Proximity turned into predation. Light-skinned children born to maids and cooks were living evidence no one could hide. Enslaved mothers lived in terror of the mistress noticing a resemblance. Some kept their babies out of sight as much as possible, or begged to have them sent to the fields early, anything to avoid the rage that could follow discovery. Harriet Jacobs, forced to serve in a North Carolina planter's home as a teenager, later wrote in her memoir that her owner, Dr. James Norcom, fathered 11 children with the women he enslaved. 11 human beings he could whip, sell, or ignore at will, because every one of them was legally his property, born from assaults he never had to answer for. This wasn't hidden vice or rare cruelty. It was policy on an industrial scale, sanctified by law, religion, and the balance sheet. And every child who resulted, no matter who the father was, entered the world with one legal identity already stamped on them: property. Make no mistake, Every forced pairing, every midnight visit, every girl pushed into motherhood at 13 had one purpose and one purpose only: money. Slave traders spoke about it with the same casual pride a factory owner reserves for quarterly earnings. One Virginia dealer openly boasted that his stock operation produced 6,000 sale-ready children in a year, more profit than any tobacco harvest he'd ever seen. Thomas Jefferson himself, in a letter that still survives, coolly described enslaved women and their babies as the one investment that reliably returned 4% annual growth, better than land, better than banks, compound interest measured in heartbeats. By the 1850s, the numbers were astronomical. Economists today estimate the total market value of the 4 million enslaved Americans at roughly $4 billion, more than the combined worth of all the railroads, factories, gold, and silver in the entire country. Human beings had become the single most valuable asset class in the United States. And then the South took the horror one step further into the surreal. With no legal rights to their own bodies, enslaved people could be signed over as collateral. Starting in the 1830s, banks in Louisiana, Mississippi, and South Carolina began accepting slaves as mortgage security, exactly like houses or acreage. Those mortgages were bundled, sliced, and sold off as bonds on markets in New York, London, and Paris. Investors who would have recoiled at owning a plantation directly happily bought paper, backed by the rising price of human flesh. Citizens of countries that had outlawed slavery decades earlier were now earning quiet dividends from rape schedules and auction blocks thousands of miles away. In one of history's blackest jokes, the same enlightened 1808 ban that supposedly struck a blow against the slave trade actually midwifed the world's first large-scale securitization of human beings. The Atlantic trade died, but Wall Street, in everything but name, was born on the backs of chained children. That's the ledger behind the Magnolias. That's the real capital of the Old South. If these hidden corridors of history leave you speechless, do us a favor. Smash the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. There are darker rooms still to open.